Right, I'm going to take you back to begin with to the summer of 1959 on the Isle of Man. I'm not going to take anything for granted. So at that point, Man was a tourist isle, massive resort. It was on great communications, sea and air networks that today just don't exist. You know, you could get flights from the Republic and the north of Ireland, from Scotland, from the Midlands, all air routes that have gone. So a mass trade of holidaymakers, tourists who wanted that sense of the familiar, you know, fried breakfasts, rock, seasides, cheap and cheerful leisure, but also the different. You know, it's on the Gulf Stream. Think of the Wicker Man and Summer Isle, you know, winter gardens, better climate, a Gaelic society, you know, Gaelic Manx still survives. That most Manx were only 2-3 generations from the plough. So it's this interplay of the familiar. You could go on your holidays, people spoke English, didn't have to learn another language, but also something different, something a little bit mysterious. And the Isle, which I'll allude to maybe a bit later if we've got time, consciously had played on this in drumming up the tourist trade from the 1920s really onwards. So Gerald falls into an established pattern. He's building on traditions that were already there. So the summer of 1959, Pathé News send out a film crew, and they're going to do a tourist film. The staff at the museum are really excited. They all get the day off work. They all play parts of ordinary Manx people doing things that they'd never done before, leaving cream out for the fairies and all kinds of things like that. But at the very climax of the short film, we have Gerald Gardner. We have Gerald, bearing in mind this is, you know, the 1950s, an age of austerity, an age of the sort of moral backlash after the period immediately after the Second World War, and in an island which isn't really known for being liberal. You know, homosexuality was still illegal on the Isle until the early 1990s. Yeah, they birched people on into the 1980s. So liberality isn't something that comes particularly readily when people in the mainstream think about man. So here you have this thoroughly countercultural figure in his corduroys and sandals and red sweater, performing a rite at the crossroads in Castletown in the south of the Isle. If you look at the film closely enough, his sweater rolls up, you can see his tribal tattoos that he had done in Borneo and Malaya. You can see his ceremonial bangle. His athame is sticking out of his back pocket. So in all these kinds of things, you know, the wearing of a beard in the pre-hippie beatnik period, of which we'll talk a little bit later, is thoroughly out of kilter with what we think about. This is somebody who's countercultural on any level. But the little bit of film and what Gerald does in it, I think, is instructive. And it's instructive about his view of Wicca and his view of witchcraft. He performs a little rite, sweeping the crossroads in the village. Yeah? And, you know, he has his besom and he takes it up into an old shoe. And he says what he's doing is, you know, an old witchcraft rite that prevents bad luck. And this is rooted in the Isle. Okay? So, he's establishing witchcraft as something beneficial, something socially useful, something incredibly positive. You're helping the people, you're helping the land, all these kinds of things. The thing is, when you look at where he got the rite from, and there's a great Manx folklore survey that goes on for years and years and years, where they record these little rites. When you go back to look at that and see where Gerald found it from, it's quite different. It's not about ensuring good harvests, good luck, removing ill fortune. It's actually counter magic. It's about being overlooked. You didn't use a broom, you used a goose's wing. You certainly didn't use an old shoe to collect everything up. So what Gardner is doing there in microcosm, as so often in his career, is he's inverting the norms. The witch, the symbol of fear, the symbol of terror, the crone who, sickens the cattle, kills the babe in the cradle, wastes the crop, is totally different. It's passing from a figure of fear to a figure of empowerment, from a negative to a positive. Something that's rooted in the landscape, something that's helpful, something that's overwhelmingly positive. And this, I'd suggest to you, is all in Gerald's gift to the way we think about magic, the way we think about popular magic, the way we think about ritual, and of course, the way Wicca has grown and grown and grown in the years since his passing. So, how did Gardner end up there? How did Gardner seem to be something, an individual that fitted in with the landscape? You can find, a few years ago I was in a junk shop in the north of the Isle, and I found a tourist postcard, and Gardner is there beside the horse trams and the flower displays, sitting there with a ceremonial sword, and the back says, Gerald Gardner, Manx witch. Of course he's not Manx, but interestingly he's assumed to be, very often when you talk to old people on the Isle, he's assumed to have been Manx rather than, from Merseyside, near where I grew up. So Gardner is successful in all kinds of levels. But how did he get there? Why is the Isle of Man important? Why is it important to him? And if it was, why has it been overlooked? So in the next 20 minutes or so, hopefully, I'll give you some kind of answer. Gardner is there, and the great weight of his work is based around his witchcraft museum. That's what he does, that's what he establishes. But he hadn't been the first one to do that. Cecil Williamson, his one-time friend and later rival, the pair had met just round the corner in the wonderful Atlantis bookshop, downstairs in the basement. They'd got talking over some books in 1949, struck up a friendship. They'd both been in imperial service in different ways. Although I should say here, one of the things I go on about in this book, and another one I'm bringing out for Cambridge in a week or two, is that a lot of those things, a lot of the myths that have collected around Gerald, like bindweed, are just that, they're myths. If you go, looking at these wonderfully stacked shelves, if you look in a lot of the popular books about witchcraft and the history of modern witchcraft, what you tend to find again and again and again said about Gerald is that he was a retired imperial civil servant. Now think about the loading and the cultural loading on all of those things. Actually, when he's pensioned off, he's far from our idea of somebody who's retired. He's 54. He's young, he's physical, he's tanned, he's had a life of, hard work. So he's a fairly buff guy, let's put it like that. His interplay with empire is at best tangential. He doesn't drop out of anything because he's never bought in the first place. Christianity is just always another religion seemingly to him from the very outset. So he sees tribal religion and tribal magic as things that live, because he's experienced them as a young guy in Malaya and in Borneo. So it's not the sense that he comes, as many of us have done, to a bookshop and starts reading about the stuff. He sees the things, he sees the rituals, he sees the rites, he sees people scrying, he sees people working skyclad, he sees them, drawing down gods, he attends the seances. So he's more a sort of Kimball O'Hara than he is a sort of Conradian character. More than that, his whole basis, this idea of the civil servant, what he was at best a customs officer who policed and possibly profited from the opium trade. British rule in Malaya is predicated on opium. That's how the empire is financed there. And despite America's objections from the 1920s onwards, and Gardner is there to regulate the trade. That's what he does. Goes up and down the river in his little cutter. And I've just seen dear Philip Heselton's wonderful books there. And as Philip says, there's always a mystery about where Gerald gets his money from. And it's anybody's guess how much kickback he was taking from the opium dealers up and down. Got it from somewhere. Interestingly, Gerald doesn't drink. He hates alcohol, partly because of his abusive governess when he's a kid. Hates alcohol, hates drunks, hates all of that. Doesn't like marijuana. Speaks very highly about opiates. So join the dots, kids. Yeah. Don't. We'll all be on a terrorist list. So what I'm trying to say is, when you look at Gerald, lots of the stuff breaks down. One of the myths that's in some of the books, because he and Williamson later unfortunately fell out, is this idea that Gardner arrives on the Isle of Man, leaving the taxi running at the Williamsons' front gate with nowhere else to go, like an old seabird, washed up on the ebb tide. They calm him down, they sort him out, they give him a role in the Williamsons' museum that had been established there for a couple of years, a few months actually, and that he gradually kind of takes over like a Tartuffe character. All of that is nonsense. It's all hogwash. What happened was that Cecil Williamson had been hired to make a film about the TT races, the motorbikes, and he was fascinated by the occult, and he thought about opening up a museum. The Isle and the tourist board were surprisingly tolerant, unlike lots of places in England, and he settled on the Windmill Farm, the future site of what Gerald called the Witch's Mill. He opens a centre of superstition and magic, but for the opening publicity, what he really needs is a witch to make stuff work. What he does initially is he looks around for Manx witches, of which there are none, because none existed. Whatever people say, they weren't there, there's nothing, right? Ideally, he wants a woman, can't find a woman. Gerald fills the void, comes over, does the opening rite, okay, and thereafter becomes kind of witch in residence. They have a contract. Gerald's got lots of unsold copies of his book, his novel, High Magic's Aid, and the deal is that Gerald will give people a tour of the museum, some theatricality, and then he can sign his book in the tea room afterwards, like a book launch every day, really. And this settles down. There's a wonderful correspondence in the really great, we'll talk about it at the end, hopefully, if we've got time, the museum in Boscastle. There's the correspondence between Gerald and Williamson at this period. Gerald comes over for the summer seasons, takes lodgings, stays in the George Hotel. He's a man of money and means. It's not like the taxi was ever running out on him. And he's full of ideas how to make the museum better. Can we get an amphitheatre? Can we put on performances? Can we put on plays? Can we get people from the local theatre to come up and do this? Can we costume it? Why don't we show people what witchcraft, what magic are? Why don't we have these installations? Why don't we have a witch's cottage? Why don't I bring my witch's cottage over with me? Well, they couldn't, because they couldn't demolish it from 5 acres, and also Williamson couldn't afford it. But he's full of ideas, what the place should look like, how things should be framed, how witchcraft ought to be presented. The only problem with this is that, Williamson begins to run out of money, and Gerald invests. So he gradually takes on the lease for the building, so he becomes effectively the landlord. And in return, what he asks is that he has his own stuff, his own stuff is already being displayed. He wants more say in the running of the museum. And gradually the views of Williamson and Gardner become disjointed. So Williamson has, I think it's fair to say, a far darker view of witchcraft. It's about curses and cursing. He wants to have a torture chamber. He has a later museum on the Isle, very briefly, that's a museum of torture. He does a disastrous thing in the 1953 tourist season where he has a Mau Mau exhibition, considering that the emergency in Kenya was still going on, and it was full of all the sort of tabloid horror stories about the Africa, the Kikuyu who were fighting for their freedom, basically. So it becomes this big storm on the island, and people don't like it because there are, there's still national service, people they know are serving out there during, the fighting, all these kinds of things. So he kind of mistimes it. Gardner objects to the way stuff's being shown. He's got this wonderful revelatory passage where he talks about, we don't want any of that Dennis Wheatley rubbish. We don't want any sensational things. Things have to be done right. And he says this again and again and again. So the two men come to a break. It's Gardner, Gardner had a thread of steel running right the way through him, and he could be ruthless when folk got in his way. And he basically demands the mortgage payments. Williamson hasn't got the money, and he possesses the whole thing, other than the artifacts, which Williamson moves out, And there are lurid tales about Cecil smashing up the toilets, rubbing off all the little stickers on the cutler, on the porcelain in the cafe, and all these kinds of things, and they're overstated again. But what we find is, by the 1954 season, Gerald has his own museum, and begins to stock it. What does he have? How are we doing for time, folks?
Oh, absolutely fine.
We're okay? Okay. So what would we see if we were lucky enough to go back to the setting of the newly redesignated Museum of Magic and Witchcraft on the Isle of Man, or the Witch's Mill as it was known? Well, you'd see the windmill tower itself. You can see it there on the cover, the iconic shell that had been burned out by a fire in Victorian times. You'd have the granary buildings next to it that Gardner extended. It was always Williamson's plan to build on the artifacts, but Gerald actually does it and has the money to invest. So eventually there are three stories. On the ground floor there's the Witch's Kitchen, which was an integral part actually of the museum's success, because it stayed open long hours. It had, under Angus MacLeod's there, but under William Worrell it has a jive club and a jukebox, so it's open. If you think about that 1960s sort of beat scene, they have dances. Gardner later builds a sprung ballroom on the back. Worrell and MacLeod, who are his business managers really, work really long hours, but they keep the cafe open. They have the coach trips coming in with the holiday makers from Douglas, the big centre, the island's capital. And contrary again to popular opinion, it's a little gold mine, They have rock bands there. Later in the 60s, under Monique and Scotty, you have, DJs who play the latest records from from out of the UFO club in Covent Garden, So the finger is on the pulse, it's creative, it's definitely countercultural. You have then, we know this through the guidebooks, we've got this very eclectic mix, everything from alleged artifacts from Crowley to French 19th century bayonets masquerading as ceremonial daggers, to Lucky Charms, to scrying balls, to an amazing black mirror that the young woman who managed the museum with her partner for Monique and Scotty in the late 1960s was fascinated by this great black mirror. She wrote a novel about it, actually, a very good novel. That was a Victorian fairground mirror that Gerald had painted with the names of archangels, and that was used for scrying. On the first floor you've got two installations. You've got the Witch's Cottage, which is, Gerald's idea of what a 17th century, witch's hearth would look like. Notably with the witch's tools on the chest altar. And I think this is important to get a sense of, that the museum operated on all kinds of different levels. You could go and take the kids, and there'd be a little frisson, you know, of danger about seeing the witches. But you know, you got your crisps and your pop afterwards. You could go to the milk bar, you could go to the dances. You could go and look around and, you know, get freaked out by the artifacts. Or you could get interested, because what Gardner is showing people is this is a living tradition. Okay, it's a living tradition that he'd kind of created himself, or actually to be fair, what he'd done is he'd taken, as Ronald Hutton has shown in his amazing study of the Triumph of the Moon, he'd been the one who was able to take lots of countercultural tendencies and ideas that had been current for about a century before, and welded them into a form that was different, new, relevant, that brought women to the fore and stripped the devil out, which is his great contribution, his genius in actual fact, something even Michelet had never managed to do. Michelet's still got the devil, Margaret Murray's still got the devil, Gardner kind of gets rid of that. So he lays everything out, you know, he's got the chalk ritual circle, the idea that this was the magic of the people. He's then got the sort of high magician's circle over on the other side to show the difference. It's very different from the earlier installation that Cecil Williamson had had. Cecil had had very much an Order of the Golden Dawn or Aleister Crowley setup. Beautiful painted altars, and the quarter points done by Steffi Grant. You know, it must have been a riot of colour. The designs still survive again in Boscastle, with great Tibetan censers, and you know, you can imagine the wafts of incense, big heavy curtains, all this kind of stuff. Gardner doesn't hang on to this, and his stuff is far more John Dee, you know, than Aleister Crowley. It's far more the Magus in the 17th century, and of course, being Gerald, he manages to get a religious form that ticks all his boxes for the things that fascinated him. So he uses his collection of arms and armour. There's always a suit of armour, there's always a sword, there's always a crossbow in these places. The other thing he's got, I think very significantly, and again, it was an idea Cecil had had, but Gardner puts it in an entirely different form. Cecil had had a monument to the victims of superstition that was modernist. It was a sphere, you know, it was conceptual, it was abstract art. Originally he wanted a great megalith thing, you know, but obviously he couldn't afford the stone, so it was quite a modest little thing actually when you look at the photos. But of course, a victim of superstition, that could be the witch or the persecutor, couldn't it? It could be either. Gardner, when he takes over, creates what he calls a monument to the 9 million, which from Matilda Jocelyn Gage was the figure people used to think was the total number of witches who'd suffered during the European witch trials. Now we know it was a far smaller figure, but she was working on the, you know, in the Victorian period, she was working on the figure she had. So Gardner has this conception, so it's about honouring the witches, the martyrs of the craft, and it must have been a thing of, I think, rare beauty and power. Gardner, and he was a great draftsman, as me and Hugh were talking about earlier, paints Margaret Quain, who was a Manx witch who was burned in 1617 alongside her son in the marketplace in Castletown. Unlike the English, but like the Scots, the Manx burned. Okay, this was their big cause célèbre. It was something that was so frightful, only the two of them are burned on the Isle, but it was something that was so dramatic, it totally altered the way that the Manx thought about witch persecution thereafter. It was almost impossible, basically, for a Manx jury to convict a witch. English judges and justices try the evangelical upsurge of the early 18th century. Bishop Wilson writes against witches. Challoner, the governor in the 1650s, writes against his juries, but the Manx will not convict witches. But Gardner takes Margaret Quain and he doesn't know how old she is, but of course, being Gerald, she looks like a 1950s starlet, in a long dress showing a bit of leg and all the rest of it as the flames rise up. And he has her as a centerpiece draped in black velvet. It's an altar that's movable, and again he has offerings and incense. And it's that idea at a time when museums were not terribly interactive, that it elicits an emotional response from people. It has the power to move, to stimulate thought, to have affinity and empathy with what is going on. The upper gallery was the new gallery, where again there was another magical circle inscribed on the wall, on the floor, and a lot of museum cabinets with Gerald's collection. So it was quite a thing, before you even got to the Shell Tower. And Gardner had this, he wove a mystique about it, undeniably. He had, according to some of the people I interviewed, an amazing gift for stillness, that he'd pretend to be a waxwork, and he could hold this, and then whether it was workmen or young or old women or children, he'd suddenly spring to life and terrify them. He had an ability to move silently, but to engage particularly with, young people. Some of the people who'd known him thought he was amazing, because they kept saying that he was the first adult they'd ever known who didn't talk down to them, who talked to them at their own level. And he ran, being Gerald, his own sort of Sherlock Holmes style Baker Street irregulars, where he had a gang of kids who were charged to find him interesting stuff, artifacts. So some of them turned up with a 17th century cannonball, which he then tried to swap them, get this on health and safety lines, he tried to do them a swap for his wife's revolver. But so they give him this constant thing of musket balls and coins, and and the Isle, Castletown's been around, the castle's been there for 1500, 1,000 years, should we say. There's a lot of stuff built up, so he had this sort of magpie urge that again made him interesting in the community. Talking of which, just to throw you some little anecdotes, he was also famed. I mean, it was great. One of the nice things about doing the book was everybody who spoke about him with affection. It's a pretty rare thing very often, particularly the way his career, thanks to that ratbag Charles Cardell, was just ruined. He had muck thrown at him. He had somebody who was paid to infiltrate his own coven here in London. I mean, how messed up does that get? But everybody talked about him with affection, and one of the things they would say was that he rode his black bicycle at breakneck speeds around the old streets, scattering people, children, OAPs in wild abandon. At one point he hooked up somebody's handbag and sort of dragged it a couple of blocks along. So Gardner is very much part of the fabric of the Isle. And I think it's important because had Gardner, fate is a funny old thing, isn't it? Had Gardner passed on before he took over the museum, would any of us remember him? A couple of, let's face it, fairly unreadable novels, a kind of interesting book on Malay magical daggers. That's kind of it. But it was on the Isle that he wrote Witchcraft Today and the Meaning of Witchcraft. He identifies himself, and this again is protective colouring of the age. He takes his credentials, his spurious doctorate that he never actually had, and allies it with this thing that he is the director of the Museum of Witchcraft and Magic. So suddenly he has credentials, he has a place in what was still a very hierarchical society. So he brings his books out. If you look at them closely enough, Margaret Quain and her son are in there. There are pictures of them in another one of Gardner's illustrations. He uses Manx folklore an awful lot in terms of, there's this continual questing, creative, interesting thing about Gardner. He's always young, I think. That's what attracts, people like Patricia Crowther to him, who, after all, her and Arnold are initiated on the Isle by him. So the idea is the museum operates on lots of different levels. It draws people in. It's almost life imitating art. Say it and it'll happen, do it and they will come. And certainly by 1960, Gardner has a Manx coven of fluctuating numbers. We've got a great sketch of it in Henri Dawes' little novella that he wrote about the Isle at the time. We've got Gardner's right-hand man, Angus MacLeod, who actually in many respects gave some of the imagery and feel to early Wicca. You couldn't go to shops like this and buy magical artifacts. So MacLeod's running a workshop where, alongside Gardner, he forges ritual swords, bangles for the priests and high priestesses. So some of the early aesthetics are from MacLeod, who again is somebody who I've never met anybody to have a bad word about, and actually is so important for being the continuity. When bad times hit the pagan community on the Isle, it was MacLeod who gave it dignity, was the one who really kept it through that kind of period through his decency and creativity. So Gardner has a circle. The Athol Press, because Daw was a millionaire who happened to own all the newspapers on the Isle, Gardner benefits. He gets everything from typewriters and stationery the newspaper doesn't need, to lots of advertising space. You look at the 1960 Book for Christmas column in the Isle of Man Times, and it's one of Gerald Gardner's. So he's a personality, he has a museum, he has something that attracts and really is crucial, I think, for the projection and the growth of Wicca in this period. Why does it get forgotten? And we'll run into the last period over this. Well, essentially because it doesn't last. As you'll know, Gardner dies at sea in 1964 on one of his cruises out of the Isle, and at the last minute, almost it seems, because he revised his will when he was in the Lebanon, leaves the mill to Monique and Scotty Wilson, who have it until 1973, beginning of 74. Now, the Wilsons are significant in the history of Wicca, not least because, I think you can fairly say, they're pivotal in the export to North America. Not entirely, because one of the interesting things is Gardner is already writing and promoting Wicca for the North American market in his last years. Specifically, he writes articles about Manx folklore. His last published one is on Manx witchcraft and folklore. He writes a delightful story for the North American press about his familiar spirit, a gremlin called George, who plays tricks on him and hides things around the house and bites through all the electric cables in his cottage. So again, you get this sense of Gardner as puckish. But Monique and Scotty are the ones who initiate Ray and Rosemary Buckland, the Long Island line, who take Wicca effectively to the United States and seed it there. So they're significant. They come out of the blue. So a lot of Gardner's people are surprised when they take over in the way that they do. They're kind of seen as cuckoos in the nest by Gardner's other high priestesses. But things go all right for them for a period. They're bequeathed Gardner's fortune, his property, his artifacts. They quickly buy out William Worrell, because the idea was that Worrell, who was the museum manager, would keep the museum together, the actual artifacts, and carry on managing it, and they would do the rest. But they don't get on, so they buy Worrell out. But then things go wrong. They don't work terribly hard at it. They don't put the hours in. They don't have a manager. The coach excursions stop coming from Douglas. Everything begins to get a bit down at heel. their lifestyle becomes, freewheeling isn't the word for it, and then on top of it, American newspaper interest picks up. There's a big feature on them in the early 70s, and from that, Ripley's Believe It or Not Museum make them a big offer for the entire collection. It's notable when you read the reports of the Ripley's agents who come out that Scotty and Monique didn't understand what was really valuable and what wasn't. So they don't actually understand what they have in the collections. What I will say for them is they were absolutely sincere in their beliefs, that they were great teachers and propagators of what Gerald had taught them. But for instance, when you hear them interviewed on the radio, there's loads of stuff that they can't explain beyond what Gerald has told them. And Scotty's view of history was non-existent. I mean, he just didn't, he kind of flannels, and annoyingly he talks over his wife when you want to hear what the High Priestess is saying, and he just rolls over her, "Well, darling, I think," and you just think, can you, please just let it go. So they sell up, they get a bar in Franco's Spain of all places, and disappear off the scene, and the museum disappears from the Manx landscape literally overnight. And I'll leave you with this, I'll leave you with a poignant bit, and then we'll go into something a little bit more positive for the finale. But there's the very poignant story that Angus MacLeod, who was then living a short walk away at Scarlet Point in the farmhouse that he loved, turned up as the Ripley's vans were coming in and out, shoveling everything away. He'd been estranged from the Wilsons for a few years. He got his own coven going at Port St Mary. There was another coven by another split from Gerald's group in the north of the Isle, out near Derby at that point. But Angus is dumbfounded that he sees the museum being broken up, and he goes into the ballroom, and there's this terrible thing where all of Gerald's papers and sketches are just blowing around, in the wind where the doors have been left open and the windows. And he he says to Monique, "Well, does anybody want them?" "No, have them. Don't care. We've got a bonfire going anyway. Anything Ripley's aren't taking, we're just skipping." So he takes some of these. Some of the private stuff he himself burns on the beach at Scarlet the following Halloween, but he keeps some of it, Most notably, one of Gerald's books, Shadows, that is much debated and talked about. For those who are interested in such things, or the Manx book as it's sometimes concerned. But what you see from what Angus preserved actually is Gerald's methodology. Up until his last days, he's typing out new bits of rituals. It's something that's ongoing. You can't be a Wicca Taliban. You can't stick something in aspic, because the thing is always growing and mutating and changing. And Gardner, up until his last months, is quite clearly refining, bringing new things on, altering texts, getting best fits, and you get this wonderful little cache of papers with the stuff that Angus saved. So, Angus sees all of that. But I think, just to finish on, going back to where we began, you've got this sense, the sort of spin of that little 1950s Pathé film is all about the island having its very own Prospero, the magic worker, and the Isle having a sentience and a rich folklore itself. And in many ways Gardner fulfills that role, and whatever we think about magic and its efficacy and its reality, I think there was a true magic, one based around vision and intellect and excitement and creativity, that Gardner and those who circled with him and around him brought to the Isle and succeeded beyond their wildest dreams in implanting in a popular consciousness that informs so much of modern day popular culture and makes wonderful bookshops like Watkins and the surviving museum from Cecil's collection at Boscastle such real treasure houses down to this day. So, if you want a magic to wield, that seems a pretty potent one. So we'll leave it there, and I think we've probably got 20 minutes for Q&A.
Yeah.
Is that right? Yeah. Okay.
Thank you very much.
There you go. 20-minute Q&A and just statements, if that's okay. Yeah? Stuff people want to know. Or bashful. Yeah, go on.
I see. We talked about Cecil Williamson.
Yeah.
Obviously, what do you make of his claims to have had some kind of background in witchcraft himself? Because it sounded like the way you described it, sounded like he didn't know all that much really. What was your view on it?
Well, he did. I'm unfair if you're going away with this thinking that Cecil didn't know anything. He did. He was fascinated. He wrote. He performed his own rituals. You can see the photos of him. And again, but it is the kind of cursing. He's sticking nails in things, and it's all a bit dark and Crowley-esque. So again, he's an amazingly creative, interesting guy who has got his own path. So yes, he has his own vision of witchcraft. As you'll know later on, he goes into all the sort of the traditional things and is very scathing about Gardner. So it's a very different path, but it's one that is as legitimate as Gerald's. And that's what's really great about those early years, that you get this sense of friendship between the two men when you read their letters and their correspondence, and this sense of an exchange of ideas and information. So when Gardner goes to Ghana after it's before it's independent. Yeah, it's about the independence time. Cecil sends him, a kind of wish list. Can you buy these magical things for me off tribal magicians? And Gardner, dutifully does, and sends him an annotated note on what they're actually doing. So you get this great sense of this symbiotic relationship where they were sparking ideas off each other. Yeah? But like everything, it's love and hate are so closely conjoined, unfortunately, that the things that very often bring people together act like the opposite magnetic poles and propel them apart. So that's the kind of tragedy of their relationship. And in fact, Williamson had another, almost 40 years just slagging Gerald off whenever he could and taking a posthumous revenge. So, yeah. So Cecil certainly isn't a kind of also-ran. It's a proper partnership. Yes.
Is there much more that can be said about Angus MacLeod, Paul Canoe on the island, those people that were surrounding
Yeah.
Were they producing works themselves and poetry and sizing material art?
Yeah, well, it's good you picked up Paul as well, Mystic Paul as he was known, and his beret. So there's the supporting cast. I think both are interviewed by the Folklife Commission, and they give interviews in the mid-1970s. Angus talks to the local media quite a lot because he's got his own business in art and metalwork and souvenirs. He writes a lovely little edition of his poems in the 1980s that are kind of interesting because, I think what you can see Gardner's attraction, both in terms of Paul and Angus, in people who are creative, people who are good with their hands, just like him. He's got this camaraderie with them, and they spark off each other, and it infuses, I think, Gardner's vision of Wicca. So if you look at the kind of mishmash of politics, and I mean party political politics in early Wicca, it's kind of all over the place for a period. The occult has been associated with fascism, with the hard right, all of these kinds of things. Wheatley is no friend to anything other than Hitlerite totalitarianism. But Gardner, on the other hand, is mixing with these people who, MacLeod is in CND, Patricia Crowther is animal rights, Paul is kind of mystic on the vague left, you know, is an immigrant to the Isle, you know, it's come over from France, all these kinds of things. So again, it's this other layer, you know. I think I've worked Angus about as far as Angus will go, you know, in terms of interviews and stuff, and I'm sure it'll make a nice little monograph on him. But he was just a terrific, wonderful person, you know. And it's kind of uncanny, you know. Sometimes when you research somebody, and I can remember reading one of the interviews with Angus, and he says, oh, well, you know, a lot of the stuff I've been involved with hasn't really taken off. But I've got this, you know, I've got this sense, this premonition, that some writer will come looking for me one day, and you think, well, you know, that's where we are. And I did an interview with this lad, and it was really moving. So, 13-year-old who's on a school trip to the Isle, and it's pre-internet, and he doesn't know the museum's gone. He's interested in witchcraft. He's read Witchcraft Today, and he gives his teachers the slip. And he turns up at the mill complex, and of course it's all derelict, it's shuttered, you know, it's just gone. And somebody working in, you know, the front garden says, oh, well, there's a witch up the road. And he only knew him, and I had to tell him Angus's name. He said, oh, it's old Scotty, you know, go and see Scotty, he lives up at Scarlet. So he sets off and goes up and knocks on the door, and Angus has him in and makes him a cup of tea and talks to him about witchcraft and what he's interested in, and sits him down. And the lad turns to go and says to him, well, you know, will I see you again? And Angus sort of looks wistful and says, well, I'm sure our paths will cross, you know. And it's that wonderful sense of this sort of humanity and this decency, particularly because Wicca got such a bad name on the Isle for various reasons in the 1970s and early 80s as climates changed and behaviours became different. So they're fascinating people, and there's this. What I've tried to get into the book is this sense of the supportive cast for early Wicca. You know, it is Arnold and Patricia Crowther, it is Paula Canoe, it is Henri Dore, it is Angus. So there were all these people and some others that were there, but you know, you have to respect your sources, don't you? If people don't want to be named, you know, sometimes, you know, I think that's the other thing I would say in terms of the history of Wicca that Ronald is so great about, you know. He doesn't name Dafo's real name in the first edition of the Triumph of the Moon, you know, because he respects the privacy of her family. It's only when she gets outed by the whole world and their dog in the second edition, you know, he names her. So I think sometimes you've got that heady desire to tell all, to get the expose. It's not great, you know. There are some things, if people want to have their private religion, you've got to respect that. So what I'm saying is there was a larger cast of folk, you know, take my word for it or don't, but believe you me, but they're the ones who were firmly out the broom closet, yeah, that we know about. And that it tells you that from almost the word go, there's this whole group of really interesting people, you know. Jack Bracelin goes over to the Isle, you know. So it's more than a one-man band. I should say that it gets left and interesting around Angus and Paul. You know, it's very different, and they were people generationally who were too old for the sort of late 1960s, but they're certainly infused by beat culture, and they're kind of hippies before the hippie thing arose. That's where they are. You know, everybody has a beard. In fact, in the local press, it's always commented upon. Local craftsman, the bearded Angus MacLeod. You know, and it's like a trope. You know, it's like a signal. And they talk about them all wearing polar neck sweaters, you know. Paul and his berets, you know, all that kind of stuff that then was, you know, really kind of risky. Yeah. Anybody else? But yeah, it's a lovely question. It's nice these people get remembered, because they weren't really not so long ago. Yeah, the lady at the back, then I'll go to the front. Yeah.
I wonder if Jerry is related to Jerry Strait. in Chinatown?
Mm,
Jerry, related to Jerry Street in
No.
Chinatown now?
no, no.
Because I was told that it's Jerry who is related to the Opium War in China.
Well, fortunately, Gardner and his family had nothing to do with the Opium War in China. You know, the Gardners are merchants from Liverpool. They make rope. That's what the family fortune is predicated on. The one thing I would say, though, to come off the family, you know, and Gardner is fascinated by the East. I had a long, well, I don't know if rouse the wrong word, shall we say, disagreement with somebody who was very academic, who just tried to write Gerald off and say, well, he's just another Orientalist. But I think he's different. I think he actually listens. He's interested in the indigenous peoples. He doesn't have, I think, that sense of ingrained superiority that was there from a lot of other people in his generation. The interesting thing on the Isle is the north part of the Isle was the retirement home from lots of imperial types. They'd retire there with their money, you know, and they were known as When I Was, which means when I was in Bangalore, or, you know, when I was in Malacca. And I can remember them as kids, these awful people. Have you ever seen that wonderful French and Saunders sketch where they play these two dreadful old imperialist women talking about tribalism, stuffing cake, and that one of them has a fox stole and it comes alive, and they're all that was the vibe you're getting. Gardner never goes to the north of the Isle. He never mixes with those people at all. You know, he's out there with Paul and Angus, yeah, and others, and Henri Dore. So it's very different. So no, fortunately, the you know, and Gardner as well, he weaves a great tale, you know, his Scottish ancestry. He wasn't Scottish, you know, he just wasn't, but he likes appropriating the Celticism, you know, and, you know, I'm sure kind of sometimes believed his own myths as well. So, lady at the front. Yeah.
I'm curious about his embodied experience of seeing these tribal societies during his work time, and I'm wondering if that was really something that brought him to earth-based wisdom tradition. It feels like a big difference that evolved between him and Williamson could have been, you know, based on that embodied experience of people being connected to the place where they have always been, the indigeneity of the tribes that he saw.
I'm sure, to be fair to Cecil, he'd seen similar things because, again, he was a tea planter in Zimbabwe.
Oh, okay.
So he'd seen rituals as well. So, you know, let's not run one down to the other. But I think, yes, with Gerald, I think that connection that isn't really spelled out in a lot of places, that magic was not dead for him.
Right. So,
you know, for those of you who don't know, Gerald has the most dysfunctional childhood you can think about. Yeah, and it's something I talk about in the new book that's in press. You know, Jack Bracelin was convinced he was illegitimate and that his terrible governess was actually his mother. Other people say it's not true, but there is something very weird if you just look at it. Gardner, unlike his brothers, does not go to school, right? And everybody says, oh well, it was his asthma, they take him to the med, they take him on these things. Sorry, you do not hoik a small frail child off to Malaya for their health, particularly in the early years of the 20th century. You know, it's not great. So Com, his nurse, takes him off, and he doesn't really ever go back. You know, he has zero formal education. And then Gardner settles where her and her husband buy, a rubber plantation. He's only in the New Forest because when they retire and sell up, they go to the New Forest, and he follows them. So he has this terrible, abusive relationship with this woman who quite clearly, you read his autobiography, she quite clearly abused him. Yeah? And you begin to wonder, don't you? But the more, shall I say, the positive influence on his childhood is he doesn't drop out because he was never in. You know, Christianity, as I say, in a way, totally unlike the dominant relationship it had on most people's lives until very recently for British and Irish people, doesn't really seem to have affected him. It was a comparative religion like all these other things he's experiencing. So when he sees the magic of a tribe, it's something that is living and valid. It's not learned. That's what I'm trying to say.
That's, I guess, what I was
it's
trying
yeah.
to get at in my question.
Yeah.
It feels like it was more alive in him
Yeah.
in an embodied way
Yeah.
than in an intellectual way. And now that you've told me he's uneducated,
Well,
not formally educated.
Not formally educated.
Not formally.
I think he's incredibly bright and creative.
Absolutely.
And I think
But he
that's...
didn't have to unlearn things.
He didn't have to unlearn things, and he's not... You know, and I think that's why Wicca is what it is, because it's fresh, it's new, it's pagan, because Gardner understands the essence of paganism, because it's not reflected through a duality of a god and a devil. There's kind of none of that, and that gives him an intellectual freedom that, you know, Dion Fortune is amazing, but she's hooked into a, you know, into a monotheistic culture in the way Gardner just isn't. Now you can have academic debates about, because the only real source for this is Gardner's official biography, part written by Jack Bracelin, part written by Idris Shah, and Shah lived in a little bungalow on the Isle of Man at Onken Head while he was writing and working on it. So he's another one of the cast of people, very influential on Robert Graves as well. They had a great creative partnership after. So we've only got Gardner's word for it, but I think that carries weight. Yeah, I don't think it, you know, you get back to the reductionist argument you sometimes have with academics, where they say, how can we know anything? Well, you know, you kind of that's the skill and the art of it. So I think Gardner is far more interesting, far more positive, if you like, than his many denigrators have made him out to be. You know, he gets a bad rap for a long time by people who would never have said the things that they said when he was alive, and even some of the people he worked with were not terribly loyal, you know. And I don't mean the Anguses, the Patricias, the Arnolds. I mean some of the, you know, or Jack Bracelin. Some of the others were not quite as kind to him as they might have been when they'd sat at his feet. And then I'll let you.
And so you mentioned, well, you kind of touched on it a little bit earlier on when you said about had he passed before he took over the museum.
Yeah.
And you kind of mentioned it a little bit at the end of the book, where obviously some sources of Wicca and witchcraft these days tend to just completely gloss over him.
Yeah.
They're just kind of baby out with the bathwater, you know. But what I wondered was, did you have any sort of hypothetical concept of if he hadn't have died when he did, the sort of 5 or 10 years after?
If he hadn't have died when he did, what could we, you know? I mean, history's great fun, isn't it? Particularly counterfactual history, because you can make any old thing up and say, you know, when I worked in my day job in unions, if I had £1 for every book called The Lost Leader of the Left, I'd be very rich, because what you can do is you can project all your wish fulfillment on a blank space, can't you? It's like the rock star, it's like James Dean, you know? Because you die young and stay pretty, you know, there's all that potential. What would Gardner have done? What he would have done, what it's very clear he would have done, he would have continued promoting Wicca in North America, you know? He would probably have written a book on Manx witchcraft and magic, the notes of which survive in Toronto in the collection. They're very fragmentary. he would have carried on initiating people. He would have continued to promote Arnold and Patricia Crowther as people who were writing in his vein. They've already started publishing in the last couple of years of Gerald's life. So I think we can say that for certain. Then there's the other game you can play that says if he hadn't have altered his will and he'd have given the museum to anyone but Monique, you know, it would have been a great success. But we don't know, do we? No? But I think, you know, you'd have had lots more interesting stuff from the old boy, you know? And you know, you wouldn't have had Cardell's muckraking pamphlet come out when it did. You know? Which certainly, you know, damaged his posthumous reputation. And I think as well, just to go off on a slight tangent before we get one person in, and you know, you can all exit via the gift shop, in a true Gerald way. In fact, I should tell you, I was at a family do quite recently, and my aunt said something about, "Oh, you're interested in witch things, aren't you?" Oh yeah, I took your grandmother to that museum that was on the Isle. You know, this is and you've never told me this before. And she said, oh yeah, there was some old boy there who tried to get us to buy one of his books, and he said he'd sign it, but we didn't. What can you do with your family, you know? But just this idea that I wouldn't be interested in it. But sorry, I've lost my. Yeah, I think there are lots of false. When you see Wicca discussed, a lot of times, I think people talk about the wrong things. This is my personal view. There is nothing wrong with being the first. There's nothing wrong out of creating from nothing or adapting. So if we think about classical religion, if we think about the Oracle at Delphi, if we think about the rites, if we think about the altars blazing bright, okay, for hundreds of years, these things were human created. You know, if you read your Robert Graves, if you read any comparative religion, Greek and Greco-Roman religion mutated. You know, the mystery cults, Mithras, the pagan revival under Apuleius in North Africa, where Apuleius is a pretty close rival to Jesus at one point, you know. There are all these things going on, and they were self-creating in a tradition with a religious and creative impulse. So when people go on about Gerald making stuff up or looking for a source or looking, God help us, for a tradition, well, does it matter if it comes out of a religious vision and a creative impulse? Is it any the less? I think it is, unless you get back into some sort of fundamentalism. So, you know, I don't think there's anything wrong with accepting that Christianity triumphed for a period, but there was enough cultural interest and impulse that Gardner was able to light the altar fires that had lain dormant for a millennia. And I think that's something to take pride, you know, in and interest in. And it stops you going round in a circle in a sort of weird Wicca fundamentalism kind of thing. You know, if you look at all these things, all the claims after Gerald died, if you read a lot of the things that popped up then, it's, well, we want this thing that looks like Wicca, that acts like Wicca, that has the woman foregrounded, that has the priestess, that has the moon, but doesn't have Gerald. Yeah? Oh, but we can find it through this spurious source. We've uncovered another batch of traditional witches somewhere. Really? You know? Okay. And then you look back, and yeah, you may have, but they don't predate Margaret Murray and her work. You know? You know, that's the other thing. And again, this is maybe a subject for another day, but we beat up Margaret Murray, I think, rather unfairly because of her gender. And, you know, bad history, but great literature. You know, great romantic stuff. Probably got time for one more because I know. Oh no! Okay, that's all, folks. We've got the call.
to finish
Yeah.
on, actually.
Fine.
So
there we
thank
go.
you, John.
So with that, we'll go. Yeah.